Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, far back, to a place where justice was swift, often brutal, and always absolute. You're entering Imperial China. A realm where the emperor's stern gaze wasn't just a metaphor for supreme power, it was the ultimate arbiter of fate, governing every aspect of life. From the grand affairs of state down to the smallest village dispute. His word was law, his judgment final, and his wrath, well, let's just say you probably wouldn't have survived back then if you were on the receiving end. Imagine a society structured like a perfectly ordered, yet incredibly fragile, pyramid. At its very apex sits the emperor, the son of heaven, whose authority was considered divine. This wasn't just a political title, it was a religious one. His decrees rippled down through layers of bureaucracy, magistrates, and local officials, eventually reaching every commoner, every farmer, every merchant. The concept of individual rights as we understand them today was, to put it mildly, not really a thing. Your life, your property, your very breath, were ultimately at the emperor's discretion. You can almost feel the weight of this absolute power in the air. The very architecture of imperial palaces, with their imposing gates and vast, echoing courtyards, was designed to inspire awe and submission. Every official wore specific robes, every ritual was meticulously observed, all reinforcing the idea that the emperor was beyond reproach, beyond question. It's like living in a perfectly choreographed dance where one wrong step could send you tumbling into oblivion. This wasn't a system based on innocent until proven guilty, or a jury of your peers. Justice was often about maintaining social order, reinforcing imperial authority, and demonstrating the consequences of defying the established hierarchy. A crime wasn't just an offense against an individual, it was an offense against the cosmic order, against the emperor, and against heaven itself. This made even minor transgressions feel like enormous affronts, deserving of severe retribution. A historically accurate event that underscores this pervasive imperial authority is the Emperor Yongl's brutal purges during the early Ming dynasty. After usurping the throne from his nephew, he launched extensive campaigns to eliminate anyone even remotely associated with the previous regime, including scholars, officials, and their entire families. This was not a trial by jury scenario. It was a direct application of the emperor's absolute will, demonstrating that his stern gaze could lead to the complete annihilation of perceived enemies, regardless of legal process. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about imperial justice is the concept of avoiding the taboos. Commoners had to be incredibly careful not to use certain words that were part of the emperor's personal name or the names of his ancestors. Using such a word, even accidentally, could be considered a grave offense, an act of disrespect punishable by severe means. Imagine having to constantly censor your vocabulary, just in case you uttered a forbidden syllable. It's like playing a game of linguistic minefield every single day. Historians still argue whether the extreme severity of imperial punishments was primarily a tool for effective governance and deterrence, or if it often masked underlying political insecurity and the emperor's fear of dissent. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're about to explore the terrifying world of justice in feudal China. As you step deeper into this ancient realm, the omnipresent shadow of the emperor's authority gives way to the concrete framework that underpinned it, the law's iron grip. Imperial China wasn't a land without laws. On the contrary, it was governed by meticulously compiled legal codes, some of the most comprehensive in the world for their time. These codes, however, were less about protecting individual rights and more about maintaining social order, reinforcing hierarchies, and ensuring the absolute power of the state. You see the scroll unrolling before you, filled with characters that dictate every aspect of life and punishment. The most famous of these codes, like the Tang Code or the Great Ming Code, were remarkably systematic. detailing offenses and their prescribed penalties with chilling precision. They were designed to be universally applied, at least in theory, providing a uniform legal framework across the vast empire. Think of it as a massive, ancient instruction manual for how to behave, with very clear penalties for deviating from the script. And unlike your typical instruction manual, you couldn't just throw this one away if you didn't like the rules. These codes covered everything from murder and theft to much more subtle transgressions like disrespecting elders, improper ritual conduct, or even expressing disloyalty to the emperor. The severity of the punishment was directly correlated with the perceived gravity of the offense against the imperial order or societal harmony. For instance, harming a parent was a far more heinous crime than harming a stranger, reflecting the Confucian emphasis on filial piety. A historically accurate event that highlights the reach and severity of these codes is the concept of rebellious speech, or seditious poetry. During various dynasties, scholars or officials who wrote poems or essays that were interpreted as critical of the emperor, even subtly, could face charges of treason. The consequences were devastating, often leading to execution and the extermination of their entire clan. The famous literary inquisitions of the Qing dynasty are a stark example, where even a single misplaced character in a text could lead to immense suffering. This wasn't about what you did, but what you thought and how you expressed it. A bizarre or lesser-known fact within these legal codes was the detailed categorization of tools used in crime. For example, the legal texts would specify different penalties for theft depending on whether the thief used a ladder, dug a tunnel, or simply broke a window. It's like having a very specific tariff for every imaginable method of breaking and entering, a bureaucratic nightmare for any aspiring criminal. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these legal codes truly led to more just outcomes, or if their intricate nature simply gave more power to interpreters and local officials, allowing for arbitrary application. The legal system wasn't just punitive, it was also designed to instill fear and obedience. The clear, uncompromising nature of the punishments was meant to deter potential wrongdoers and maintain a tightly controlled society. You lived under the constant awareness that the law's iron grip could, at any moment, reach out and pull you into its unforgiving embrace. It was a world where legal precedents stretched back for centuries, a continuous thread of control that bound generations to the dictates of the imperial throne. Every legal document, every judgment, was a testament to the unchanging, formidable power of the state. With the iron grip of the law now firmly in your mind, you begin to grasp another fundamental aspect of imperial Chinese justice: how crime and hierarchy were inextricably intertwined. In this society, your social status wasn't just about where you lived or what clothes you wore. It intricately influenced both the definition of a crime and, critically, the severity of its punishment. Justice was anything but equal. You see a web of unspoken rules and ingrained privilege stretching across the social landscape. At the very top, the imperial family and high-ranking officials often enjoyed a degree of immunity or faced vastly different forms of retribution. At the bottom, commoners, peasants, and especially slaves, had fewer rights and faced the harshest interpretations of the law. It's like a game of Monopoly where some players start with hotels and get to draw get out of jail free cards, while others just have a single pawn and land on boardwalk every time. Consider the concept of status offenses. A crime committed by a subordinate against a superior, son against father, wife against husband, commoner against official, was always considered far more heinous and punished more severely than the same crime committed in reverse. For example, striking a parent could be a capital offense, while a parent striking a child was often seen as within their rights. This wasn't about the physical act itself, but the disruption of the social order. A historically accurate event that powerfully illustrates this disparity is the 8 deliberations, Ba'i, a set of privileges codified in the Tang Code. These allowed certain high-ranking individuals, like imperial relatives, senior officials, and those with great virtue or ability, to have their crimes treated differently. They might be allowed to redeem their sentence with a fine, be pardoned, or simply face a lesser punishment than a commoner for the exact same offense. This wasn't a secret handshake. It was explicitly written into the law, showcasing a legal system that openly favored the elite. A bizarre or lesser-known fact is that during certain dynasties, if an official committed a serious crime, they might be permitted to commit suicide as a more honorable alternative to public execution, especially if their rank was very high. This allowed them to avoid the shame of public display and preserve some dignity for their family, a privilege certainly not extended to the common populace. Imagine being offered a polite way to end your life as a form of mercy. Historians still argue whether the hierarchical nature of punishments actually stabilized society by reinforcing authority, or if it bred resentment and undermined the very concept of fairness. The common adage, "Punishment does not extend to the great officers, ritual does not descend to the common people," succinctly captured this reality. While this was a Confucian ideal emphasizing different forms of control for different classes, in practice, it meant that the great officers were often exempt from the harshest physical punishments. You might see a high-ranking corrupt official dismissed from his post or exiled, while a peasant caught stealing a loaf of bread might face a severe beating or even death. The law, like a chameleon, changed its color depending on whose skin it touched. This inherent bias permeated every level of the legal system, from the initial accusation to the final judgment, solidifying the rigid social structure of imperial China. Leaving the formal structures of imperial law and its inherent biases behind, your journey now takes you to the ground level, where justice was often rough, ready, and deeply personal. The realm of village justice, local horror. In the vastness of imperial China, far from the emperor's stern gaze in the capital, local magistrates and village elders often wielded immense power, administering justice with crude and immediate methods that could be terrifyingly arbitrary. You find yourself in a dusty village square, perhaps under the shade of an ancient banyan tree, where disputes are settled and wrongdoers are publicly shamed. This wasn't a courtroom with intricate legal procedures. It was a communal space where reputation mattered more than legal precedents, and collective harmony was prioritized over individual rights. Imagine your entire community as your judge and jury, with very few avenues for appeal if they decided you were guilty. It's like a really intense neighborhood watch meeting, but instead of just complaining about loud music, they decide your fate. Local magistrates, often the lowest rung of the imperial bureaucracy, held significant authority. They were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and hearing local cases. Their decisions, while theoretically guided by the imperial codes, were often influenced by local customs, personal biases, and the need to preserve stability in their assigned area. They were the emperor's direct representatives in miniature, with all the power and sometimes capriciousness that implied. A historically accurate event that showcases this local power is the widespread practice of bamboo justice for minor offenses, or even just perceived disrespect. A magistrate could order a person to be beaten with a bamboo stick on the spot. This was a common form of punishment, often administered publicly, designed to inflict pain and shame without necessarily leading to death. While seemingly minor compared to capital punishment, a severe bamboo beating could still result in permanent injury or even death, particularly if the magistrate was angry or corrupt. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about village justice involved divination, or oaths, as a means of determining guilt. In cases where concrete evidence was scarce, a magistrate or elder might demand that a suspect swear an oath before a local deity or undergo a form of ordeal, like walking on hot coals, though this was rare and often symbolic, believing that the gods would reveal the truth. Imagine trying to prove your innocence not with facts, but by appealing to the supernatural. Historians still argue whether the reliance on local customs and informal justice mechanisms genuinely reflected the needs of the communities, or if it simply perpetuated cycles of abuse and limited avenues for true redress. The power of village elders was also formidable. They were the moral authorities, arbiters of tradition, and often the first point of contact for resolving disputes. Their judgments, while lacking the official weight of an imperial decree, carried immense social pressure. To be ostracized by your village elders could be a fate worse than physical punishment, leading to social isolation and economic ruin. You lived in a tightly knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and a mistake could follow you for generations. The immediacy and often brutal simplicity of village justice served as a constant reminder that in imperial China, the law's reach, even if administered locally, was long and unforgiving. Stepping away from the rustic, often brutal, realities of local village justice, your journey now takes you directly into the heart of the imperial state's punitive machinery. The formidable world of the Grand Inquisitors. These weren't just ordinary officials. They were the emperor's specialized agents, tasked with investigating the most serious crimes, particularly those involving treason, corruption, or anything that threatened the stability of the throne. You can almost feel the chill in the air as you enter their offices. A place where meticulous records were kept and grim decisions were made. These inquisitors, often members of specialized judicial bodies like the Censorate or the Ministry of Justice, operated with vast powers. They were responsible for scrutinizing high-ranking officials, uncovering plots, and rooting out any form of dissent that could undermine imperial authority. Imagine an FBI, CIA, and Supreme Court all rolled into one, with unlimited power and very little oversight. It's a job that would give anyone nightmares, especially if you were on their suspect list. Their investigations were thorough, systematic, and often merciless. They wouldn't just look for direct evidence, they delved into family connections, financial records, and every whisper of suspicion. The goal was not just to find the guilty party, but to understand the full scope of a conspiracy, and to identify all those involved, no matter how distant their connection. This was a state mechanism designed for absolute control, with very little room for error or mercy. A historically accurate event that grimly illustrates the power of these Grand Inquisitors is the case of the Blue Lantern Society, during the reign of Emperor Qianlong. This was a massive literary inquisition where a seemingly innocuous collection of poems was interpreted as seditious. The inquisitors launched a sweeping investigation, leading to the arrest, torture, and execution of hundreds of scholars and their families, even those with only tangential connections to the offending texts. The scope of their power to destroy lives based on perceived threats was truly terrifying. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about these inquisitions involved the extensive use of confidential memorial systems. High-ranking officials or even eunuchs could send secret reports directly to the emperor, bypassing regular bureaucratic channels. These memorials, often filled with accusations and suspicions, would then trigger investigations by the Grand Inquisitors. Imagine living in a world where anyone could drop a secret, anonymous tip to the ultimate authority, potentially ruining your life without you even knowing who accused you. Historians still argue whether the extreme measures employed by these imperial inquisitors were genuinely necessary to maintain order in such a vast empire, or if they often served as tools for political repression and personal vendettas. The pressure on the accused was immense. To be summoned by a Grand Inquisitor was often a death sentence in waiting, as they rarely failed to secure a confession, by any means necessary. Even if you were innocent, the sheer weight of the state machinery, combined with the methods of interrogation we'll discuss next, often ensured compliance. You were a tiny ant under the heel of a giant, with no hope of escape. The Grand Inquisitors were the embodiment of the Emperor's reach, their silent efficiency a terrifying testament to the absolute power of the imperial state. Having observed the formidable power of the Grand Inquisitors, your journey now takes a darker turn into the chilling chambers of interrogation, mind games, body pain. Here, the line between justice and torment blurred. Where the extraction of a confession was paramount, often regardless of guilt or innocence. In imperial China, a confession was considered the ultimate proof, and various methods, both psychological and physical, were employed to secure it. You step into a dimly lit room, perhaps with heavy wooden beams and a single, flickering lantern casting long shadows. The air is heavy, not just with the scent of dust and fear, but with the residue of countless struggles. This isn't about logical questioning or evidence gathering, it's about breaking a person's will. About making them admit to whatever the authorities wish to hear. Imagine being trapped in a room where your only way out is to say what they want, even if it's a lie. It's a terrifying game of psychological attrition, where your body often pays the price. The psychological pressure alone could be immense. Suspects might be subjected to prolonged sleep deprivation, constant questioning, or the terrifying sight of various instruments of torture before any physical coercion even began. They might be told that their family was being tortured, or that their loved ones would suffer if they did not confess. This mental torment was often a precursor, designed to soften the resolve of the accused before the physical pain commenced. A historically accurate event that showcases the reliance on confession is the practice of beating the confession out, or sunzhou. For centuries, even relatively minor cases often involved physical beating to elicit a confession. The Tang Code, while sophisticated for its time, explicitly allowed for the use of torture in interrogations, specifying the number of strokes allowed for various levels of offense. This wasn't a secret, but a sanctioned method. The idea was that a truly innocent person would withstand the pain, while the guilty would break. Of course, that theory conveniently ignored the reality that anyone, innocent or not, could be made to confess under sufficient duress. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about these interrogations is the use of pressure sticks, or finger squeezers. These devices, made of wood, would be placed between a suspect's fingers or toes and then tightened, inflicting excruciating pain without necessarily breaking bones, though they could cause severe crushing injuries. Imagine having your digits slowly, relentlessly crushed, knowing that relief would only come with a spoken confession. Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on confessions extracted through torture led to more effective crime solving, or if it simply resulted in countless false admissions and miscarriages of justice. The goal was always a signed or stated confession. Without it, the case was often considered incomplete. This created a perverse incentive for interrogators to push their suspects to the breaking point. The pain could range from severe beatings with bamboo rods to more elaborate and agonizing methods, which we will explore in a later section. You might hear the muffled screams from a nearby chamber, a grim symphony of despair that served as a constant reminder of what awaited those who resisted. In these chambers, truth was often less important than compliance, and freedom was bought with a lie. Emerging from the oppressive silence of the interrogation chambers, your journey now leads you to the bustling, yet hushed, public squares of imperial China, where justice took on a theatrical, terrifying form, public spectacle, moral lesson. Punishments weren't just about inflicting pain or deprivation, they were carefully staged performances, designed to instill fear, reinforce imperial authority, and teach the populace a grim, unforgettable lesson about the consequences of transgression. You stand among the silent crowd, feeling the collective tension. The air is thick with anticipation. Perhaps the smell of sweat and dust, as eyes are fixed on a raised platform or a prominent street corner. This wasn't a private affair, it was an event, often announced in advance, drawing villagers and townspeople to witness the emperor's justice firsthand. Imagine the most captivating, yet horrifying, play you could ever see, where the actors are real and the stakes are life and death. It's a chilling reminder that, back then, entertainment often came with a very dark side. The purpose was twofold: to punish the individual and to deter the masses. Seeing a condemned person suffer, often stripped of dignity and exposed to public ridicule, was meant to create a visceral fear of the law. It was a clear, unambiguous message: defy the emperor, violate the codes, and this could be your fate. The state understood the power of visual communication long before the advent of mass media. A historically accurate event that frequently became a public spectacle was the display of severed heads. After executions for serious crimes, particularly treason or rebellion, the heads of the condemned would often be publicly displayed in cages or on poles at city gates or busy crossroads. This was a clear warning to any potential dissenters. A grim trophy of imperial power. The sight, intended to shock and intimidate, served as a stark reminder of the emperor's ultimate authority. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about these public displays involved the use of shame cages, or kangs, jia. These were heavy wooden collars, often quite large, that would be locked around a person's neck, forcing them into a stooped position and preventing them from feeding themselves. The kang, sometimes weighing over 100 pounds, would be worn for days, weeks, or even months, with the condemned displayed in public places. People passing by were expected to witness their suffering, and sometimes even had to feed them. Imagine being trapped in a giant, public dog collar, completely helpless and exposed to everyone's gaze. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of public shaming and degradation was more effective at preventing crime than the physical pain of punishment itself. The execution grounds themselves often became grim landmarks, places where the boundaries between life and death were publicly, brutally crossed. Whether it was a simple bamboo beating for a minor offense or a public beheading for a major crime, the audience was an essential part of the punishment. Their silence, their gasps, their averted eyes, all contributed to the intended effect. You might see a family member weeping openly, or a stern official reading the charges aloud. Every detail meticulously designed to amplify the moral lesson. This relentless use of public display ensured that the terrifying reach of imperial law was etched deeply into the collective consciousness of the people, leaving the grim theater of public spectacle. Your journey now takes you to a different kind of confinement, one that extended the agony of punishment far beyond the immediate moment, the terrifying reality of exile, a living death. For many in imperial China, banishment to distant, desolate lands was considered a fate almost as severe as execution, a slow, agonizing process of erasure from society. You can almost feel the endless stretches of barren landscape, the biting winds, or the oppressive humidity of an unfamiliar frontier. Exile wasn't a relaxing sabbatical. It was a deliberate act of stripping a person of everything familiar, their family, their home, their social standing, and their very identity. Imagine being plucked from your life in, say, Nam Dinh, and summarily dropped off in the middle of a vast, unpopulated desert thousands of kilometers away, with nothing but the clothes on your back. It's a bit more severe than being sent to your room without dessert, isn't it? The destinations for exile were strategically chosen: remote border regions, malarial swamps, or inhospitable mountainous areas. These were places considered undesirable, dangerous, and far from the comforting familiarity of established civilization. The journey itself was often grueling, with exiles forced to walk for months, vulnerable to bandits, disease, and starvation. Many never even reached their destination, perishing along the way. A historically accurate event that grimly illustrates the impact of exile is the fate of many officials during the literary inquisitions of the Qin dynasty. Even if not directly executed, those implicated were often banished to far-flung military outposts or isolated villages in the empire's periphery. These scholarly exiles faced immense hardship, often dying from the harsh conditions, loneliness, or lack of proper medical care. Their intellectual pursuits, which had once defined them, became a cruel irony in a life devoid of books or stimulating company. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about exile was the practice of permanent exile with no possibility of return. This wasn't just a temporary banishment. It was a sentence designed to literally remove a person from the collective memory of the imperial heartland. Their names would be struck from official records in their hometowns, and their families were often forbidden from even attempting contact. Imagine being legally erased, becoming a non-person. Living out your days in a place no one cares about, knowing you will never see home again. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of exile was to simply remove dissenters from the capital, or if it was also intended as a form of human resource management, populating remote areas with a captive labor force. Life in exile was a daily struggle for survival. Without their previous networks of support, exiled individuals often faced poverty, starvation, and social ostracization. They might be forced into manual labor, stripped of their former dignity. The psychological toll was immense: the loneliness, the shame, the constant reminder of their fallen status. For many, exile truly was a living death, a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion. Far from the stern gaze of the emperor, yet still utterly controlled by his unforgiving decree. From the desolate landscape of exile, your journey now takes you to another form of slow, grinding torment, the realm of forced labor, toil until death. For countless individuals in imperial China, a sentence to forced labor meant a life of grueling physical exertion. Often under brutal conditions, a punishment designed to extract maximum utility from the condemned while simultaneously punishing them. You can almost feel the ache in your muscles, the sting of sweat in your eyes, and the relentless sun beating down as you envision the scene. These aren't just work assignments, they are sentences to endless, backbreaking toil. Condemned individuals, ranging from common criminals to disgraced officials, were put to work on massive imperial projects, constructing defensive walls, digging canals, mining precious minerals, or even building elaborate tombs for the emperor. Imagine being forced to build the equivalent of a modern skyscraper, but with nothing more than hand tools and sheer human muscle. It's like being sentenced to a lifetime of extreme CrossFit, except the only prize is continued survival. The conditions were notoriously harsh. Laborers faced long hours, meager rations, inadequate shelter, and constant supervision by often cruel overseers. Disease was rampant, accidents frequent, and escape nearly impossible. The work itself was often dangerous. Whether it was tunneling deep underground in a mine or lifting massive stones for a new palace, survival was not guaranteed, and for many, the sentence to forced labor was effectively a death sentence, just stretched out over a longer, more agonizing period. A historically accurate event that grimly illustrates the scale and brutality of forced labor is the construction of the Great Wall of China during various dynasties, particularly under Emperor Qin Shi Huang. While certainly a monumental achievement, its construction involved the forced conscription of millions of peasants and prisoners. Countless lives were lost due to exhaustion, starvation, disease, and injuries. Many who were sentenced to forced labor on the wall never returned home, their bodies interred within the very structure they were compelled to build. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about forced labor was the practice of branding convicts. Those sentenced to forced labor, especially those sent to distant garrisons or mines, might be branded on their faces or bodies, not just as identification but as a permanent mark of their criminal status. This branding served as a visible stigma, making it impossible for them to ever truly escape their past, even if they somehow survived their sentence. Imagine a permanent, inescapable tattoo that screams, "Criminal," to everyone you meet. Historians still argue whether the economic benefits derived from forced labor outweighed the immense human cost and the potential for social unrest caused by such widespread cruelty. The daily routine was one of relentless monotony and physical pain. You would rise before dawn, work until dusk, and then collapse into a rough, crowded barack, only to repeat the cycle the next day. There was no rest, no respite, only the endless demand for more labor. For many, the hope of ever returning home, or even seeing their families again, faded with each passing, grueling day. This was a system designed to extract every last ounce of energy from the condemned, turning human beings into disposable tools for the glory of the empire. From the grinding despair of forced labor, your journey into imperial Chinese justice now brings you to a more immediate, yet equally chilling, category of punishment: corporal punishments. painful education. These were forms of physical discipline designed not necessarily to kill, but to inflict significant pain, public humiliation, and serve as a visceral lesson for both the condemned and the onlookers. You can almost hear the sharp crack of a bamboo stick, the grunt of pain, and the collective gasp from a gathered crowd. These punishments were direct, brutal, and often administered in public squares or government offices, turning the human body into a canvas for state-sanctioned agony. This wasn't about subtle psychological manipulation. It was about raw, undeniable pain. Imagine getting a really bad spanking from your parents, but instead of a hand, it's a thick stick. And instead of your parents, it's a government official. A lot less comforting, wouldn't you agree? The most common form was the bamboo beating, chi, which we touched upon earlier. Depending on the severity of the crime, the number of strokes varied. Even a seemingly minor offense could warrant dozens of strokes. Administered by trained professionals who knew exactly where to strike for maximum pain without necessarily causing immediate death. The back, buttocks, and legs were common targets, leaving gruesome welts and often making walking incredibly difficult for days or weeks. A historically accurate event that highlights the widespread use of this punishment is its application to disgraced officials. While higher-ranking officials might be spared public display, they were often subjected to internal beatings as a form of reprimand. Even if they survived, the physical scars and the humiliation would serve as a constant reminder of their fall from grace. It was a clear message that no one was entirely above the emperor's reach, and pain was a great equalizer, even for the elite. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about these beatings was the careful distinction made between heavy and light bamboo. The type of bamboo used, its thickness, and whether it was green or dried, all impacted the severity of the blows. Officials would sometimes accept bribes to use a lighter bamboo, showcasing a strange bureaucratic nuance in the administration of pain. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of corporal punishment was an effective deterrent to petty crime, or if it simply brutalized society and led to a cycle of violence and corruption. Beyond the bamboo, other forms of corporal punishment included the finger press or ankle press, devices that would slowly crush limbs, inflicting excruciating pain without breaking the skin, leaving lasting nerve damage. There was also the ear-slicing punishment, used for perjury or defiance, where parts of the ear would be cut off, leaving a permanent disfigurement. You might see a person walking through the market with a missing earlobe, a silent, chilling mark of their past transgression. The intent was always clear: to cause suffering, to extract obedience, and to brand the individual with the physical manifestation of their crime. These punishments were a constant reminder of the state's power over the individual body. A harsh education, delivered not through words, but through agony. In imperial China, physical pain was a legitimate tool of governance, a stark reality you would constantly live with. Even in a quiet town like Namdin today, stepping away from the agonizing sting of corporal punishments, your journey into imperial Chinese justice now brings you to its grim, ultimate conclusion. The ultimate penalty, death. In a system where life was often considered disposable in the face of imperial authority, capital punishment was administered in myriad ways, ranging from the swift and decisive to the prolonged and truly gruesome. You can almost feel a cold dread creep into your bones as you contemplate the finality of this judgment. Death was not just an end, it was often a public spectacle, a final, horrifying lesson. The method of execution was carefully chosen, not just to extinguish a life, but to communicate the severity of the crime and the absolute power of the emperor. Imagine being sentenced to death, but then having to worry about how you'd die, because some methods were far worse than others. It's like having to pick your last meal, but the menu includes various ways to stop breathing. The most common form of capital punishment was beheading, Jean. This was considered a relatively swift and merciful method, often performed with a single, practiced swing of a large sword. It was frequently carried out publicly, with the condemned forced to kneel, their hands bound, before the executioner. The severed head would sometimes be displayed afterwards, as we discussed earlier, serving as a stark warning. This particular punishment was often reserved for serious felonies like murder, robbery, or certain forms of corruption. A historically accurate event that frequently led to mass beheadings was the suppression of rebellions. After a peasant uprising or a provincial revolt was crushed, the imperial army would often conduct mass executions of captured rebels. These were not individual trials, they were often swift, brutal affairs designed to send an unmistakable message to anyone considering defiance. The sheer scale of such executions could be staggering, painting a horrifying picture of imperial retribution. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about these executions involved the belief in preserving the whole body. For many Chinese, having their body dismembered was considered an especially harsh fate, as it prevented them from being whole in the afterlife. Therefore, beheading, while gruesome, was often preferred over more dismembering punishments like lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, which was reserved for the most heinous crimes, precisely because it denied the condemned the chance to have their body intact. Imagine begging for your head to be cut off, just so you could have a slightly better afterlife. Historians still argue whether the extreme cruelty of some capital punishments genuinely deterred crime, or if it simply desensitized the populace to violence and led to further brutality. Beyond beheading, other methods included strangulation, jiao, considered slightly more humane as it left the body intact, and reserved for crimes of a lesser degree than those warranting beheading. Then there were the truly horrific methods like lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, which was a prolonged, agonizing execution involving the slow removal of flesh, reserved for acts of extreme treason or patricide. There were also instances of boiling or burning, though these were rarer and often reserved for particular types of crimes or during periods of extreme imperial wrath. The variety of methods underscores the imperial state's chilling ingenuity in inflicting suffering and asserting absolute power over life and death. The ultimate penalty was not just the end of a life, but a meticulously chosen final act in the terrifying theater of feudal Chinese justice. Having explored the chilling methods of ultimate punishment, your journey now brings you to perhaps one of the most terrifying aspects of imperial Chinese justice: family guilt, collective burden. In this society, an individual's crime, particularly severe ones like treason or rebellion, could not only doom them but also extend its horrifying reach to their entire family, turning personal transgression into a collective catastrophe. You can almost feel the weight of shared destiny, a suffocating burden that bound individuals not just to their actions, but to the actions of their kin. This wasn't about individual responsibility as we understand it today. It was about the collective unit of the family, the clan, the village. A single ember of rebellion, if allowed to spread, could consume an entire lineage. Imagine a world where your sibling's mistake could mean your own death, or that of your parents, your children, your cousins. It's like being part of a team, but if one player fouls, the entire team gets sent to prison. Talk about teamwork. The concept was rooted in the idea of shared loyalty and responsibility. If one family member committed treason, it was assumed that the family unit either knew of the crime, supported it, or failed in their duty to report it. Therefore, they were all considered complicit to varying degrees. This extended to collateral relatives, sometimes reaching as far as cousins or even in-laws. A historically accurate event that grimly illustrates this principle is the extermination of 9 kinsmen, Zhu Lianzhu. This brutal punishment was reserved for the most heinous crimes, primarily high treason. It meant the execution of not just the perpetrator, but also their entire paternal clan, father's side, up to great-grandparents and down to great-grandchildren, their maternal clan, mother's side, and their wife's clan. This was not a rare, isolated event. It occurred multiple times throughout Chinese history, with famous cases like the Yongle Emperor executing thousands in the wake of his usurpation, including the family of dissident scholar Fang Xiaoru. It served as the ultimate deterrent, creating a pervasive fear of association. A bizarre or lesser-known fact related to this collective punishment was the proactive destruction of family records by those fearing implication. If a family member was accused of a grave crime, other relatives might immediately try to burn or erase any genealogical records connecting them to the condemned, in a desperate, often futile, attempt to avoid the purge. Imagine trying to delete your entire family tree from existence to save your own life. Historians still argue whether the practice of collective punishment was an effective means of ensuring social stability by promoting self-policing within families, or if it simply fostered deep-seated paranoia and resentment against the imperial state. The chilling reality of family guilt meant that every action you took, every word you spoke, carried immense weight not just for yourself, but for everyone you loved. It created an atmosphere of extreme caution and often heartbreaking decisions, as families sometimes had to disown or even betray members to try and save the rest. The fear of being implicated, of seeing your entire lineage wiped out because of one person's transgression, was a terrifying and constant shadow that hung over all but the most powerful in imperial China. Having glimpsed the devastating reach of collective punishment, where family ties became a fatal burden, your journey into imperial Chinese justice now descends into its darkest, most disturbing depths: tortures and inventive cruelty. Beyond the standard beatings and common executions, the imperial system, particularly during periods of intense political strife or for the most heinous crimes, employed truly imaginative and horrifying methods designed for maximum suffering and the absolute extraction of information or confession. You can almost feel a cold shiver run down your spine as you contemplate the grim ingenuity behind these methods. These weren't random acts of violence, they were calculated applications of pain, often perfected over centuries, with a chilling understanding of human anatomy and endurance. Imagine instruments designed to prolong agony, to break the spirit without necessarily ending life immediately. It's like a really twisted game show where the only prize is endless agony, and you're the contestant. Not exactly fun for the whole family, is it? These methods were not always openly codified but existed in the darker recesses of imperial justice, often employed by specialized executioners or during intense interrogations by grand inquisitors. They were used to extract confessions, punish perceived treason, or simply to make an example of someone who had truly offended the emperor's cosmic order. A historically accurate event that is often associated with these extreme forms of torture is the practice of lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts. While its exact practice varied and was often sensationalized, it was a recognized form of execution reserved for crimes deemed utterly heinous, such as high treason or patricide. The condemned would be slowly dismembered over a prolonged period, with cuts made to various parts of the body, designed to maximize suffering and public spectacle before death finally arrived. It was abolished in the early 20th century, but its memory lingers as a testament to imperial cruelty. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about these tortures is the iron cap, or iron hat, method, used to force confessions. An iron cap would be heated and placed on the victim's head, or sometimes a tightly fitting metal band would be gradually tightened around the skull. The intense pressure and heat would cause excruciating pain, and could eventually lead to the skull fracturing or the brain being cooked. Imagine the unbearable pressure building inside your own head, knowing that relief is only a confession away. Historians still argue whether the extreme and inventive nature of these tortures genuinely served as a powerful deterrent, or if they primarily reflected the brutal nature of authoritarian power and the dehumanization of the condemned. Other horrific methods included the wooden donkey, a device where a person was suspended over a sharp wooden spike, slowly tearing them apart. Tiger's chair, where a person's legs were bound tightly to a chair and bricks were gradually added under their feet, slowly dislocating knees and hips, or even human swine punishment, a particularly sadistic form of mutilation and dismemberment often reserved for female victims. You might hear the muffled screams from a courtyard, or see the grim, knowing looks on the faces of the guards, silent witnesses to unspeakable acts. The existence of such methods underscores the chilling efficiency of an imperial system capable of inventing and then implementing such profound suffering. Having delved into the truly chilling depths of torture's inventive cruelty, your journey now shifts to an even more elusive and pervasive aspect of imperial Chinese governance: the shadowy networks of eunuchs, spies, and secret courts. These clandestine operations often existed outside the formal legal structures, forming a parallel system of surveillance, intelligence gathering, and enforcement that could reach into every corner of the empire. You can almost feel the unseen eyes watching, the hushed whispers carrying secrets through the palace walls and into the hidden corridors of power. This wasn't about magistrates or ministries, it was about loyalty, fear, and absolute control, often directly wielded by the emperor through his most trusted, and often feared agents. Imagine living in a society where you never truly knew who was listening, or who might report your casual conversations to a secret authority. It's like having your personal data constantly monitored, but instead of targeted ads, you get a visit from a very stern and possibly lethal government agent. Not quite the same, is it? Eunuchs, castrated men who served the imperial household, often rose to immense positions of power, particularly in intelligence and internal security. Their unique access to the emperor and their presence within the inner palace allowed them to build vast networks of informants and spies, reporting directly to their imperial masters. They operated with a degree of immunity from traditional officialdom, making them incredibly effective and terrifying tools of the state. A historically accurate event that powerfully showcases the sinister role of eunuch secret police is the establishment of the Eastern Depot, Dongchang, and Western Depot, Xichang, secret agencies during the Ming Dynasty. These were intelligence and counter-espionage organizations directly under eunuch control, operating outside the regular legal system. They could arrest, interrogate, and torture anyone, including high-ranking officials, without normal legal process. Their power was absolute, their methods brutal, and their reach pervasive, effectively creating a state of terror for much of the Ming period. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about these secret courts was their use of highly personalized forms of punishment and execution, sometimes carried out in secret within the palace grounds. Unlike public executions, these private killings left no witnesses or official records, making it impossible for families to mourn or even know the full truth of what happened to their loved ones. Imagine someone simply disappearing, with no explanation, and no one daring to ask why. Historians still argue whether the reliance on secret police and extra-legal courts was a sign of a strong, efficient imperial system, or if it indicated a deep-seated insecurity and paranoia within the ruling elite. These secret courts and spy networks ensured that even the most subtle forms of dissent or corruption were swiftly detected and brutally suppressed. No one was truly safe from their gaze, not even high-ranking officials or members of the imperial family. You might hear hushed rumors of someone suddenly vanishing, or a once powerful figure inexplicably falling from grace, with no official explanation. This clandestine system, operating in the shadows, was a constant reminder that the emperor's power extended beyond the visible structures of law, reaching into the very thoughts and intentions of his subjects. The pervasive chill it cast over society in places far from the capital, even in a quiet provincial city like Namdin, was a constant, unsettling presence. Emerging from the oppressive shadows of eunuch spies and secret courts, your journey now brings you to a rare and often desperate act within imperial Chinese justice: appeals and imperial mercy. While the system was overwhelmingly rigid and punitive, there existed a glimmer of hope. A narrow avenue for the condemned or their families to seek a reprieve directly from the ultimate authority, the emperor himself. You can almost feel the weight of a desperate prayer, the fervent hope clinging to the thinnest thread. This wasn't a standard legal process, like filing an appeal in a modern court. Instead, it was an act of supplication, a desperate plea for clemency or a re-examination of a case made to the Son of Heaven, whose decision was final and absolute. Imagine your life, or the life of a loved one, hinging on the emperor's mood, his perception of justice, or perhaps even a favorable omen that day. It's like playing the lottery, where the prize is your very existence, and the odds are astronomically against you. Appeals were typically made through petitions, memorials submitted by officials on behalf of the condemned, or, in rare and daring instances, direct appeals to the emperor by family members. These were incredibly risky undertakings. A poorly worded petition, an accusation deemed disrespectful, or an appeal made at an inauspicious moment could lead to further punishment for the petitioner themselves. A historically accurate event that showcases a famous, albeit ultimately tragic, imperial appeal is the case of Yu Fei, a renowned general from the Song dynasty, falsely accused of treason by the treacherous minister Qin Hui. Yu Fei and his sons were imprisoned and eventually executed. Despite numerous appeals and petitions from loyal officials and even common people who revered him, the emperor, influenced by Qin Hui, refused to grant mercy. This case remains a powerful symbol in Chinese history of injustice, highlighting that even widespread public support or undeniable innocence could not guarantee imperial clemency if the political winds blew against you. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about these appeals was the practice of imperial confession. In certain rare instances, usually for high-ranking officials facing grave charges, the emperor might summon the accused to personally confess their crimes before him. This wasn't an interrogation, it was an opportunity for the emperor to gauge their sincerity, and potentially, if he felt inclined, to grant a lesser punishment, or even a pardon. Imagine being brought before the most powerful man in the world, knowing your future depends entirely on how convincing your apology is. Historians still argue whether instances of imperial mercy were genuine acts of benevolence, or if they were often politically calculated moves designed to demonstrate the emperor's magnanimity and reinforce his absolute authority. For the vast majority of condemned individuals, such appeals were a pipe dream. The legal system was designed to be conclusive, and official channels offered very little recourse. Yet the persistent human desire for justice, or at least a final chance, kept this faint hope alive. You might see a family member, clad in mourning clothes, kneeling endlessly outside the palace gates, clutching a petition, hoping to catch the eye of an official who might intercede on their behalf. This was the raw, desperate face of hope against an overwhelmingly powerful and unforgiving system. The quiet desperation, so palpable, would have been a common sight even in the bustling marketplaces of Nam Din. Having witnessed the desperate, often feudal, pleas for imperial mercy, your gaze now turns to the terrifying, full-scale unleashing of the emperor's wrath, rebellions, the emperor's wrath. When faced with large-scale defiance, the imperial response was swift, overwhelming, and utterly unforgiving, leaving a trail of devastation that served as the ultimate warning. You can almost smell the smoke of burning villages and hear the distant clang of steel. This wasn't about individual criminals or minor transgressions. This was about the very foundation of the empire being challenged. When a significant uprising occurred, whether it was a peasant revolt, a bandit insurgency, or a regional warlord's defiance, the imperial military apparatus would be deployed with singular purpose: to crush the rebellion completely and mercilessly. Imagine a force so overwhelming it could flatten entire regions, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. It's like calling in an entire army to deal with a single unruly protest, but with actual tanks and swords and very little negotiation. The goal was not just to defeat the rebels, but to obliterate their will to resist, and to send an unequivocal message to anyone else contemplating defiance. Imperial retribution was total, often involving not just the execution of rebel leaders, but also the slaughter of their followers, the destruction of their homes, and the devastation of their lands. The scorched earth policy was a common tactic, designed to deny rebels resources and to make an example of rebellious regions. A historically accurate event that powerfully exemplifies the emperor's wrath against rebellions is the suppression of the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864. This was one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, costing tens of millions of lives. The imperial Qing forces, often aided by foreign powers, systematically crushed the vast Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. The imperial response involved widespread massacres, particularly of civilians in rebellious areas, as well as the complete destruction of cities and infrastructure suspected of supporting the rebels. The brutality of the suppression was as terrifying as the rebellion itself, demonstrating the lengths to which the empire would go to reassert its control. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about these military suppressions was the occasional use of head money, bounties. Imperial authorities would sometimes offer rewards for the severed heads of rebel leaders or even ordinary insurgents, encouraging both soldiers and civilians to participate in the hunt. Imagine a bounty system where literal heads were the currency. It certainly gave a new, grim meaning to getting ahead in life. Historians still argue whether the extreme violence used to suppress rebellions was strategically necessary for imperial survival, or if it often exacerbated popular discontent and contributed to the long-term decline of dynasties. The aftermath of a suppressed rebellion was a chilling landscape of devastation. You would see fields lying fallow, villages reduced to ashes, and the grim spectacle of mass graves or public displays of executed rebels. Those who survived might be enslaved, exiled, or face forced conscription into the imperial army. The message was clear: challenge the Son of Heaven, and your entire world would be consumed by his unforgiving wrath. This uncompromising brutality was a cornerstone of imperial control, a terrifying reality that ensured loyalty, or at least outward compliance, across the vast empire, even reaching the quiet fields around Nam Dinh. Moving from the widespread devastation of imperial wrath, your journey now highlights a specific, often more vulnerable, demographic within the feudal justice system: women and justice, a double bind. In imperial China, women faced unique legal vulnerabilities and often harsher punishments. Caught between the rigid patriarchal structures of society and the unyielding demands of the law, you can almost feel the added weight of societal expectations and legal constraints pressing down. This wasn't a system that treated all subjects equally. Gender played a crucial, often punitive, role. Women were primarily defined by their roles within the family, as daughters, wives, mothers, or widows, and their legal status was inherently tied to their male guardians. Imagine a legal system where your rights, and even your identity, are largely determined by the men in your life. It's like playing a board game where half the players start with fewer pieces and more restrictive rules. Crimes committed by women were often viewed with particular severity, especially if they violated Confucian moral principles like filial piety, chastity, or obedience to a husband. For instance, a wife who physically harmed her husband, or a daughter who insulted her parents, could face a far more severe punishment than a man committing a similar act against someone of equal status. Conversely, a husband had significant legal leeway in disciplining his wife, often with no legal repercussions. A historically accurate event that grimly illustrates the double bind faced by women is the concept of chastity cults and their legal implications. While some women were lauded for extreme acts of chastity, like committing suicide to avoid capture or remarriage after a husband's death, those who failed to uphold such ideals could face severe social ostracization and, in some cases, legal punishment. For example, a widow who remarried too quickly after her husband's death, especially if she had been pressured by her family to do so, could be publicly shamed, stripped of her property, or even face beatings, depending on the period and local custom. A bizarre or lesser-known fact is the use of female-specific torture instruments or methods, particularly for cases involving sexual transgression or defiance of patriarchal authority. While not always officially sanctioned in the codes, historical accounts mention devices like the iron chastity belt, or specialized forms of public humiliation involving stripping or forced exposure, designed to inflict maximum shame upon women who were deemed unchaste or rebellious. Imagine punishments specifically tailored to attack a woman's honor and public image. Historians still argue whether the particularly harsh legal treatment of women in imperial China was primarily a reflection of deeply ingrained patriarchal values, or if it was also a tool to control family lineages and property rights. Women also had limited avenues for legal recourse. A wife seeking divorce, for example, had far fewer legal grounds than a husband seeking to abandon his wife. If a woman accused a man of a crime, her testimony might be given less weight, and she might even face countercharges if her accusation was deemed false or malicious. You might see a woman weeping openly in a magistrate's court, knowing that her pleas are unlikely to be heard fairly, her fate entirely in the hands of male judges. This inherent bias, rooted deeply in Confucian social structures, ensured that for women in imperial China, justice was often a terrifying and profoundly unequal experience. A harsh reality that would have been no different in a quiet provincial city like Nam Dinh than in the bustling capital. Stepping away from the stark realities of women's unequal justice, your journey now descends into the suffocating darkness of prisons, dark cells, lingering horrors. Imperial Chinese prisons were not places of rehabilitation or even simple confinement. They were often squalid, brutal holding pens where many did not survive their incarceration, serving as yet another layer of punishment. You can almost smell the damp earth, the stale air, and the pervasive odor of human waste and fear. These aren't modern correctional facilities with visiting hours and exercise yards. They are grim, windowless cells, often underground or within fortress-like government compounds. Prisoners were crammed into small, unventilated spaces, often chained together, their movements severely restricted. Imagine being locked in a tiny, dark room with dozens of other people, with no light, no sanitation, and little hope. It's like living in a really, really bad sardine can, but you're the sardine. The conditions were appalling. Food was meager and often spoiled, water scarce, and hygiene virtually non-existent. Disease was rampant, with typhus, dysentery, and smallpox sweeping through the inmate population. Guards were often cruel and corrupt, extorting bribes for basic necessities like clean water or a slightly less painful chain. Survival often depended on the ability of family members to provide food, blankets, or even pay off the guards, if they even knew where their loved one was held. A historically accurate event that grimly illustrates prison conditions is the fate of political prisoners during various purges. Scholars, officials, or even imperial relatives accused of treason were often held in the harshest conditions, subjected to starvation, lack of sleep, and extreme cold or heat to break their spirits before trial or execution. Many never even made it to their formal punishment, succumbing to the brutal conditions of their incarceration. These prisons were not just holding cells, they were tools of slow, deliberate torment. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about imperial prisons was the existence of water prisons, or underground chambers that would be intentionally flooded, forcing prisoners to stand in cold water for prolonged periods, often leading to gangrene or hypothermia. These were particularly insidious forms of torture, designed to inflict immense suffering without leaving obvious external marks. Imagine slowly freezing and rotting from the inside out, day after day. Historians still argue whether the deplorable conditions in imperial prisons were a deliberate policy to inflict additional punishment, or simply a consequence of neglect and a lack of resources within the judicial system. The sounds of the prison would be a constant symphony of human misery, the clanking of chains, the coughs of the sick, the hushed moans of the suffering, and the shouts of guards. There was no escape, no reprieve, only the slow passage of time and the constant threat of further pain. For many, a sentence to prison was a death sentence in all but name, a dark prelude to oblivion, where the lingering horrors of confinement often ensured that the condemned rarely saw the light of day again. This would have been the grim reality, not just in the capital, but in any major city across the empire, even in the quiet of Nam Dinh. Having descended into the abysmal depths of imperial prisons, your journey through China's harsh justice system now reveals a punishment that, while often sparing the body, aimed to utterly annihilate the spirit, ritual humiliation, beyond the body. These were forms of condemnation designed to destroy a person's reputation, social standing, and very identity, leaving them as living shadows in the eyes of their community. You can almost feel the burning shame, the crushing weight of public scorn. This wasn't about physical pain, though it often accompanied it. It was about stripping away a person's honor, their dignity, and their place in society. In a culture deeply rooted in concepts like face and familial reputation, such punishments could be more devastating than a physical beating, leaving scars that might never heal. Imagine waking up one day to find that everyone you know, everyone in your town, suddenly views you as utterly worthless, worse than dirt. It's like being cancelled on a global scale, but with no internet, and the cancellation is permanent. These punishments often involved public displays of disgrace, official decrees of infamy, or forced acts of self-degradation. They targeted the very essence of a person's social being, ensuring that even if they lived, their life would be one of perpetual shame and ostracization. A historically accurate event that grimly highlights this is the stripping of official titles and privileges. For high-ranking officials who committed grave offenses, even if they avoided execution, their titles would be revoked, their property confiscated, and their names permanently removed from prestigious lists. This wasn't just a loss of job, it was a public declaration of worthlessness, a complete reversal of their standing. They might be forced to wear commoners' clothes, prohibited from entering official buildings, and denied any form of respect. The psychological toll of such a fall from grace could be immense, often leading to despair, or even suicide. A bizarre or lesser-known fact related to ritual humiliation was the practice of cutting off hair as a form of punishment, particularly for women. In a society where hair was considered a sacred part of the body and a symbol of familial connection and social status, having one's hair forcibly cut or shaved was an extreme act of public degradation. It signified a break from familial and societal norms, branding the individual as an outcast. Imagine having your most cherished physical attribute, one tied to your identity, publicly shorn as a mark of shame. Historians still argue whether ritual humiliation was an effective means of social control, instilling deep-seated fear of disgrace, or if it often pushed individuals to desperate acts due to the utter destruction of their social lives. Other forms of ritual humiliation included forced apologies in public, wearing specific garments that marked them as criminals or outcasts, or being subjected to public ridicule by crowds encouraged by officials. You might see a once respected scholar now forced to parade through the streets, his face smeared with ink, subjected to the jeers and scorn of the very people who once admired him. These punishments were designed to leave an indelible mark, not on the body, but on the soul, ensuring that even in life, the condemned were truly dead to the world. A horrifying reality that would have been understood and feared in every corner of imperial China, including Nam Dinh. Having explored the intricate layers of ritual humiliation, stripping away dignity to punish the soul, your journey through the terrifying landscape of feudal China's justice system now culminates in a reflection on the enduring chill of law. The harsh penal system of imperial China, with its emphasis on collective responsibility, public spectacle, and brutal enforcement, cast a long shadow over its society, shaping its cultural memory and leaving a lasting impression that resonates even today. You can almost feel the lingering echoes of fear and caution, woven into the very fabric of Chinese social behavior for centuries. This wasn't just a collection of laws, it was a pervasive philosophy, a deep-seated understanding that the state's authority was absolute, and dissent, even in thought, could lead to devastating consequences. The constant threat of severe punishment, from bamboo beatings to family extermination, fostered a society that prioritized order, obedience, and collective harmony above individual expression or rebellion. Imagine living in a society where every misstep could be your last, and where vigilance was a constant companion. It's like a perpetual game of "Don't wake the dragon," where the dragon is literally the emperor. This enduring chill is evident in the historical records themselves, often meticulously detailing crimes and punishments as warnings, and in the folk tales that pass down grim lessons through generations. The stories of ruthless officials, tragic victims, and ingenious tortures became part of the collective consciousness, shaping perceptions of justice and power for centuries. These weren't just abstract legal concepts. They were lived realities that profoundly influenced how people interacted with authority and with each other. A historically accurate event that embodies this enduring impact is the abolition of lynching, death by 1,000 cuts, in 1905. While officially removed from the legal code, its abolition was a monumental step, marking a shift towards more modern penal practices. However, the very memory and symbolism of lynching continued to haunt the popular imagination, serving as a powerful reminder of the extreme cruelty of the past. Its removal wasn't just a legal reform, it was a cultural milestone, signifying a break from centuries of brutal imperial tradition. Even if its shadow lingered. A bizarre or lesser-known fact about this legacy is how, even into the 20th century, some traditional torture devices were collected and displayed in museums. Not just as historical artifacts, but sometimes with the lingering intention of reminding people of the consequences of crime. Imagine a museum exhibit that still tries to intimidate you. Historians still argue whether the long-term impact of such a punitive legal system suppressed innovation and individual freedoms, or if it was a necessary and effective mechanism for governing a vast and populous empire for over 2 millennia. The enduring chill of law is also visible in the resilience and adaptability of the Chinese people. They learned to navigate this complex and often dangerous legal landscape, developing their own strategies for survival, often relying on informal networks, local customs, and deep-seated familial loyalty to protect themselves from the state's harsher impulses. You can almost see the quiet determination in their eyes, a legacy of centuries spent living under the unwavering gaze of an unforgiving legal system. The lessons of that terrifying past, the memory of those severe punishments, would have subtly informed the daily lives and cautious interactions of every person, even in a seemingly tranquil place like Nam Dinh, for generations. You've reached the end of our journey through the terrifying punishments of feudal China. As the final echoes of whips and chains fade into the quiet, allow yourself to drift. The dark cells, the public squares, the endless roads of exile, they all recede now. You're no longer standing in the shadow of the emperor's wrath, no longer feeling the chilling grip of ancient laws. The stories, the pain, the fear, they dissolve gently, like mist in the morning sun, melting into the soft, comforting darkness of your own peaceful space. Just breathe. And let the historical chill become a distant hum. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.